Prescience creates a paradox. The more clearly a leader can see the future, the more powerful the temptation becomes to lock the world into control of the version they fear. Frank Herbert's Dune offers a perfect laboratory for that temptation. Paul Atreides foresees a galaxy engulfed in holy war in his name, and faced with that horror makes a decision that countless political movements and visionary leaders in our world have also made. He treats the future he sees as both unavoidable and authoritative. His tragedy is not that his visions were inaccurate, it is that he mistook prediction for obligation. Instead of steering among possibilities, he commits to one path he believes to be necessary, and by committing to it, he destroys the flexibility required to prevent disaster. The narrative facts are straightforward. Again and again, Paul chooses actions that close off alternatives in the name of safety. To seize the throne, he weaponizes the Fremen's religious expectations, fully aware that doing so sets the stage for interstellar jihad. During the first years of his reign, the institutions surrounding him, warrior cadres, priestly orders, imperial administrators, congeal around a single storyline of messianic inevitability. What begins as a political maneuver ossifies into an entire system built to preserve one interpretation of the future. By the time Messiah takes place, the system no longer has any room to breathe. The Empire has become a machine that enforces the prophecy rather than responding to reality. When the inevitable crisis arrives, Paul steps aside rather than attempt to pull the system apart. Each narrowing step along the way was taken by choice, but every step was justified by the belief that no other choice would avert catastrophe. The conceptual mistake behind these decisions can be stated simply. Governing with foresight requires three things to evolve together: the choices you make now, the range of futures those choices make possible, and the values you use to judge which futures are worth pursuing. If any one of these becomes rigid, the others soon collapse. Paul freezes his values, the moral and strategic vision he believes must be realized, and treats them as destiny. Once that vision becomes fixed, the space of possible futures begins to shrink, because any alternative that does not serve that predetermined outcome is dismissed. And once options shrink, his present-day decisions lose flexibility. Instead of asking, which choice keeps many good futures alive? He begins asking, which choice keeps me aligned with the prophecy? What he calls necessity is really a self-fulfilling narrowing of the future. This narrowing follows a predictable pattern. The first step is stagnation. By treating his value system as unalterable, Paul stops updating it in response to events. When he leans fully into the messianic identity that the freemen expect, that identity freezes his decision-making. The next step is tunnel vision. Believing that only one path is safe, he avoids any action that might broaden the system, and this lack of action itself closes off alternatives. Soon, the belief that there is only one safe option becomes true, but only because every other option has been systematically discarded. The third step is metric worship. Once the system is committed to maintaining a particular image of destiny, maintaining that image becomes more important than pursuing humane ends. Paul's government begins using religious courts, imperial ceremonials, and even violence not to address real conditions, but to preserve the legitimacy story on which the system rests. This is the moment when the machinery begins to optimize symbols rather than realities. After that comes structural lock-in. The coalition of fighters, priests and bureaucrats that sustain Paul's rule becomes impossible to unwind without provoking civilizational collapse. At this point, even good faith reform would trigger upheaval. The final stage is moral and personal collapse. With alternatives gone and legitimacy brittle, Paul's sense of right action corrodes. Every decision either inflicts suffering or accelerates destruction. With no reversible options left, he chooses self-removal. To be charitable, Paul's situation was genuinely constrained. His choices were shaped by violent enemies, institutional fragility, and the immediate risk of chaos. But those constraints argue against adopting a rigid prophetic mindset, not for it. Even in hard conditions, leadership can be adaptive. A flexible approach would have sought to keep multiple futures open, by building coalitions across factions, by distributing authority so no single institution could lock in destiny, by refusing to treat religious zeal as a political asset, and by maintaining non-negotiable moral limits even in crisis. Such an approach does not deny the difficulty of Paul's position. It merely denies that fatalism was the only possible response. A wiser form of future-oriented leadership works differently. Instead of treating far-off visions as commands, it focuses on near-term decisions and continually updates its assumptions. It acts with the explicit intention of increasing the number of acceptable futures rather than decreasing them. It keeps its values open to revision through plural institutions, assemblies, councils, independent authorities, so that no single worldview can calcify into dogma. It places ethical boundaries on action that cannot be overridden by fear. And it designs its own power so that no emergency structure becomes permanent. These are the practices that preserve freedom under uncertainty. They are as relevant to democracies and corporations as they are to empires on Arrakis. The same failure Paul exhibits is visible in countless real systems. Revolutionary movements collapse pluralism to protect ideological purity. Companies double down on a single imagined winning product, even as evidence suggests they should diversify. Nations justify permanent emergency powers by pointing to a forecasted threat that never fully resolves. These failures are not failures of intelligence or intention, they are failures of optionality. They are the result of mistaking a single imagined success for a universal mandate. It is not difficult to imagine a different version of Paul's story. With a broader coalition drawing from Fremen tribes, the Landsraad, Choam, and the Bene Gesserit, with religious institutions subjected to charters and limits, with legitimacy grounded in cooperation rather than prophecy, and with the explicit refusal to sanction holy war as a tool of statecraft, Paul could have kept a wider range of humane futures alive. Not perfection, simply a landscape in which better choices remained possible. Prophecy becomes tyranny the moment it is treated as a target rather than a warning. The fundamental task of leadership is not to identify the single best future, but to preserve a wide field of viable, decent futures. Paul Atreides failed not because he saw too much, but because he used what he saw to justify closing off everything else. A wiser oracle maximizes freedom. Paul optimized inevitability, and in doing so, sealed the fate he hoped to avoid. The dynamic Paul embodies appears in modern societies whenever three forces align: a leader or movement that claims special insight into the future, a public willing to invest identity in that claim, and institutions that begin to organize themselves around maintaining the claim's legitimacy rather than responding to reality. Once these forces reinforce one another, the system becomes circular. Predictions justify policies, policies reshape institutions, and institutions produce evidence that reinforces the original prediction. This reciprocal structure can be seen in ideological governments, in populist coalitions that centralize power around a narrative of salvation or decline, and in technocratic systems that treat forecasts as inevitabilities rather than contingent possibilities. In many contemporary political environments, identity and loyalty begin to substitute for plural evaluation. Parties and movements define themselves not by the range of futures they keep open, but by the singular future they insist must come to pass. National restoration, cultural renewal, permanent growth, permanent security. When values harden into a fixed storyline, dissent becomes interpreted as existential danger. The narrative then becomes self-maintaining. Policies are chosen because they preserve the narrative. Administrative structures evolve to enforce it, and the range of permissible alternatives contracts. As this contraction accelerates, public life shifts away from negotiating shared reality and toward defending symbolic legitimacy. This is the same progression Paul's story recounts. Stagnation of moral adaptation, narrowing of perceived options, elevation of symbols over outcomes, institutional lock-in, collapse of reversible choice. The pattern is not tied to ideology. It is structural. Political movements on every part of the spectrum have fallen into it when they believe that abandoning their storyline will lead to ruin. The tragedy is that the refusal to revise the storyline is itself what generates the ruin. The lesson is not a warning against vision, ambition, or foresight. It is a warning against allowing foresight to calcify into fate. Systems remain healthy only when leaders preserve multiple pathways, revise their values in dialogue with events, and build institutions that distribute, not concentrate, the authority to define the future. When a leader claims that only one future is possible, the narrowing has already begun. The real work of governance is to keep many humane futures open, even under pressure and uncertainty. Paul Atreides failed because he believed that seeing the future obligated him to enforce it. The wiser responsibility is to use foresight to prevent inevitability, not create it.